your book and the connections with Dartington, you grew up with a strong connection to the country around Dartington, although you lived a lot of your early life in London. Can you tell me a bit about your background, your upbringing, how you grew to find out about Dartington?
Of course. So my grandfather, when he was a very young man, was sent to Burma to fight in the Second World War, and he used to talk about how the soldiers would sit around talking about what they would do after the war. Either they wanted to become civil servants or they wanted to become farmers so that they could serve the country in some way. My grandfather chose to become a farmer, and he moved down to Devon and became a tenant for a church commissioner's farm that neighboured Dartington, Riverford. He had 5 children, 4 of whom settled to work in the family business down here. My mother moved to London, but we used to spend all my summer holidays and other holidays down here. So Devon and the land around Dartington represented very much sort of escape, freedom, and an alternative life to London. And I think that for the Elmhursts and for the other people who've been drawn to Dartington for the last 100 years, it's probably formed a very similar kind of role of escapism and experimentation. Dartington and Shantiniketan Tagore's sort of experimental community in Bengal both came about as part of a sort of wave of experimental community which was promoted by, firstly, the unprecedented horror of the First World War, and then following straight on the back of that, the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was far worse than our own COVID pandemic by a long way. And I think that these two events gave rise to a sort of international zeitgeist of experimentation and a belief that the way that people had been living was unsustainable and that humankind needed to discover radical new paths. And so I think that kind of background of ferment is very important in thinking about international connections and similarities of ideas. But then Leonard himself spent most of his young life expecting to become a vicar like his father. And he lost his faith in the First World War because so many awful things happened. 2 of his brothers were killed. And he decided he was going to dedicate himself to helping mankind in a different way, which involved going off to Cornell University in America and studying agriculture. It was there that he met Dorothy Elmhurst. At that point, she wasn't Dorothy Elmhurst. She had a previous husband called Willard Straight, so she was Dorothy Straight at that point, had a huge amount of money, and she was funding a hall in memorial to her husband who had died of the influenza pandemic. So they were very much kind of at the nexus of this change. And they didn't fall in love at that point, but they became very interested in each other because they were both idealistic and both sort of passionate activists. And Dorothy, in the end, funded Leonard's expedition to go and join Rabindranath Tagore's community in Bengal. So it was sort of like quite tortuous sequence of events. Dorothy Elmhurst didn't quite trust Tagore with her own money directly. She thought he was a bit woolly-minded, and she was uncertain about whether he would necessarily spend the cash in the most successful way. So Leonard was sort of her emissary in a way, and also she was testing him basically to see whether he would be a good husband, I think, whether he would be a practical person as well as an idealistic one. So that was sort of how the connection came about. And I would say that probably at that point Dorothy was less convinced by Tagore's ideas, but Leonard became entirely enthralled to this community in Bengal, which was as diverse as Dartington in a way, and perhaps even more incoherent in that there was a university, a sort of focus on the arts, a focus on rural regeneration, an international tinge, lots of people coming from different places in the world, and it never kind of became a very systematic blueprint for a new model of living, but that was basically the idea behind it.
Utopias are a kind of social dreaming. To invent a perfect world, in a novel, a manifesto, or a living community, is to lay bare what is wrong with the real one. Utopians refuse to settle for social improvement via the usual methods: civil disobedience, electoral politics, violent revolution. Throughout history they've taken a different tack, articulating a vision of society transformed. Hungry peasants in medieval Europe dreamt of the land of cocaine, where the roads were made of pastry, rivers flowed with honey and wine, and grilled geese flew straight into your mouth. Sir Thomas More, faced with the fierce religious bigotry of 16th century England, envisaged an island nation where men and women could choose their own religion without fear, coining the word utopia in the process. These two ostensibly different visions were both ways of imagining a world in which the wrongs of the day were righted, where famine was no more or religious bigotry impossible. Both visions, examined today, offer a snapshot of the anxieties and hopes of the people who came up with them. Moore took the term utopia from the Greek utopos, no place, a play on the almost identical utopos, which means good place. For this precise Renaissance lawyer and statesman, utopias were by definition impossible to build. It was this conviction that led him to write his book, a scathing satire on the shortcomings of contemporary society.
snow it melts the soonest when the wind begins to sing. The corn it ripens fastest when the winter's setting in. And when a young man tells me that my face he'll soon forget, before we part I'll wage a groom, he'll be fain to follow it yet. The snow it melts the soonest when the winds begin to sing. And the swallow skims without a thought as long as it is spring. But when spring goes and winter blows, my laddie, you'll be fain for all your pride to follow me were it cross the stormy main. Oh, the snow it melts the soonest when the winds begin to sing. And the bee that flew in summer shone, in winter he won't sting. I've seen a young man's anger melt between the night and morn, and it's surely not a harder thing to tame a young man's scorn.
Memories of Dartington College of Arts by Dave Thompson. September 1978. It was a more innocent time. When I arrived to begin my 4-year BA honours course in theatre, the first thing I saw was a 6'4", 1.93 metres, African man standing in the road between the higher close student centre and the old courtyard buildings. He looked like a prophet wearing a traditional West African dress. He was Adewale John, also John Joseph, Joseph John and John Adewale from Sierra Leone. He said he was a Muslim and he said he was a Christian. It was a more innocent time. Larger than life, he folded himself into a Mini to drive to the Christian service in Totnes. He took me one Sunday morning, growling the hymns in his bass voice. He went on to appear in many TV shows and feature films. We didn't know this until after he died in 2011, but in 1971, he held up the Sierra Leone High Commission in Portland Place, London, at gunpoint for 48 hours. He went to prison for a short while. Then it was considered a protest, but now it would be terrorism. It was a more innocent time. Expansive, charming and chameleon. Oh, Wally, what stories I could tell about you. Dartington Hall, playground of my youth, love, intrigue, drug-fueled self-discovery and angst. You made me what I am today. Education for life. Famous people came to enlighten us. R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist specialising in psychosis, lectured us in the Great Hall one summer's day as I wafted through an artificially induced psychosis. Ironically, R.D. Laing was drunk. Later, as he wandered around the gardens, he sat with us, cross-legged on the lawn, for a while. A female Swiss student rather directly asked him, "Why are you pissed?" A girl was found drowned in a pool of the River Dart. She'd gone for a nude night swim. They think a swan held her head under the water. anxious for its signet. A girl walked home to her digs one night and got raped near the front drive. My art student girlfriend photographed me naked by the swimming pool on a hot June day. A few years later, she got life in prison for murdering her child in a satanic ritual. So the story goes. Art in social contexts. The outrage after a never-to-be-caught student wandered drunk one night into the Great Hall and urinated into the Beckstein. I know who did it. He committed the act of destruction because he was lost and confused. He paid the price. His life went wrong. He died many years ago, broken and poor. Now, pissing into a Beckstein could be considered anti-Semitic. It was a more innocent time. Famous dancers came, famous actresses and directors came, famous painters and composers. John Cage. Some students became famous after they left. They worked as hard on the theatre course. They were accused of trying to put a quart into a pint pot. The prospectus said the course was for those who wish to put themselves and their resources at the disposal of those parts of society that the established theatre does not serve. I became a stand-up comedian, wandering the world with jokes. Summer evenings meandering through the gardens in a drugged haze. Student digs in the South Flat at Sharpham House where Maurice and Ruth Ashe lived. I never collected the boxes of my stuff from their attic.
The 70s. Miniskirts, long-haired hippie youth, social revolution was still vogue. However, bell-bottoms, tank tops and platform shoes augmented the fashion parade. Glam rock meant boys and girls both wearing makeup and women's clothes. Rock stars such as Bowie flirted with androgyny and even had a relation with the particularly eccentric and talented mime artist and performer Lindsay Kemp. Mark Bolan dazzled the girls with songs like Metal Guru and attracted the lost or cynical with It Really Doesn't Matter at All, Life's a Gas. In sleepy Devon, at Dartington Hall, students, trustees and teaching staff all began to stretch their wings as new courses developed with an inherently altruistic, if sometimes naive programme that was echoed throughout the music, theatre, art and dance departments. In the middle of the 70s, the new theatre course encouraged students to dig deep into themselves and their craft, to communicate their chosen narratives, whether about gender, politics, environment, or a surreal comical expression of life which predated the programme, The Young Ones. Dartington provided me with a melee of influences, encouraged me to discover new art, dance, theatre and broaden my interest beyond studying classical music. When I later met students in London after being at Dartington, I always thought and felt the energy and magic of an exclusive club that had no barriers as far as concepts, imagination or experimentation was concerned. I felt I was part of a gigantic family, part of a large shared brain of creativity, community and experimentation.
Just tell the listeners a little bit about your take on what Leonard and Dorothy found when they went up the drive for the very first time.
Well, it's quite a ridiculous story, really. So Leonard's family came from Yorkshire. He wanted to live far away from them to do his experimentation. He was directed to the West Country by Tagore, who had been here once and thought it was the most beautiful place in Britain and the place to do experimenting. And Leonard went to a sort of upmarket estate agent with a list of all the requirements that he wanted for his estate. And
I suppose just like you do today, really.
Well,
yes.
like you do today. And then he set off not actually with Dorothy, who was still in America at that point, taking leave of her family and friends, but with his sister. And Leonard couldn't drive at that point, so he took a couple of driving lessons and then got a car and set off for Devon and visited 2 estates. The first one he didn't like, it was a bit conventional. The second one was Dartington, and he was a great romantic, and he remained to the end of his life, I think, very kind of impressed by and interested in Dartington's history, some of which he actually made up. He didn't really mind too much about the facts. Like a lot of English country houses after the First World War, Dartington had kind of gone to rack and ruin. It wasn't really affordable anymore. I think there were only a handful of people living on the entire estate. And the Great Hall, which is sort of maybe the spiritual centre of Dartington now, didn't have a roof. I think perhaps in a way the fact that there was so little there meant that it was an area that he could kind of write his vision on. And so he actually bought it without Dorothy ever.
Perhaps just explain a bit about where Dorothy comes into it. I mean, and explain about the sources of her immense fortune. Mm-hmm. Most people, I think, most commentators on this over the years have focused on Leonard. It'd be quite nice for you to talk a little bit about Dorothy. First of all, about the money, which was incredibly important, but about her ideas as well.
Yeah, so I think Dorothy is the unsung hero of Dartington, partly in consequence of the fact that she spoke less and wrote less than Leonard. But I don't think that means that her importance was any the less. So as you say, firstly, Dorothy came from an incredibly wealthy background. Her father was one of the sort of robber barons around the turn of the century in New York. He made his money partly of a monopoly over New York rail cars, so not in particularly honourable ways. And then he died when Dorothy was 17, and she was left a large part of the fortune, made her among the sort of top 10 eligible heiresses in New York. And I suppose she could have lived her life as a sort of society figure in New York very easily. But she was struck with guilt at the way her father had made his money, and felt strongly that she should dedicate her fortune to better things, which I think is completely extraordinary for someone around that age. And so she began sort of seeking how to do good with her money. And that took in a lot of different things. So she worked in sort of settlement houses for immigrants in New York. She was part of the Junior League, which is a sort of rich young women's philanthropic project. She, with her first husband, Willard Straight, she set up the New Republic, which is still going now, a very important kind of progressive journal. She helped set up the New School for Social Research, which is also still going now, which was about, at the point that it was set up, educating workers, and also about connecting academic social science with doing good in the world, doing practical good in the world. So she had a huge, portfolio of very important reforming initiatives that she had helped start before she came to Dartington. And I think sometimes because they were in America, that they're sort of disregarded or set aside a bit. And she also, of course, funded Leonard's work with Tagore, which has been very seminal in creating Dartington. So she's, the sort of infrastructure of Dartington has been important for her. And then also her priorities and interests were quite different to Leonard. So Leonard was very practical, very, very focused on farming. And Dorothy was very spiritual. And one aspect of Dartington, which I also don't think is emphasised that much, is a sort of spiritual aspect. And so she thought that this was a sort of a socio-spiritual experiment, and it was how people should, live in ways that are more satisfying, but also more spiritually fulfilling. She also was a great proponent of the professional arts. So I think that if Leonard had been the sole controller of Dartington, it would have been very much, arts would have been a sort of very amateur thing. But for Dorothy, professional artists were sort of spiritual guides as well as aesthetic guides in the world. And so she thought it was very important to support them, come what may. Just to give them money, they didn't have to make money. I think Leonard was more focused on economic functionality at Dartington. I think Dorothy was a bit further away from that. Mm-hmm. And then Dorothy is entirely the driver behind the gardens at Dartington, which I think is sort of one of the big visual markers of the magic of the estate now. She brought in Beatrix Farrand, who is practically the only kind of leading female garden designer in America at the time. Brought her over to design the gardens, and I think her imprint is still very much there. But the thing about Dorothy was, she wasn't a feminist. She wasn't someone who thought, I must set my mark on this place and everyone must see it. She was very much the sort of power behind the throne, and very happy for Leonard to be the mouthpiece of their project. So it's hard to sort of trace her influence in quite the same way as it is with Leonard.
So is there anything in the archives or in the history that ever says, did any of those people who were espousing the effort by women to get into society politically, was there any effort by them to, come down to Dartington and get this rich woman on their side? Because obviously, you'd have thought this would be a fairly obvious thing for them to do.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite a conundrum, really, Dorothy's role in all of this, because when she was a young woman in America, she supported the women's suffrage movement. She supported the women's trade union movement, and a lot of her close friends were activists in that sphere, and she put her money into it. But somehow, when she came over to England, all of that collapsed, and I didn't even find people trying to engage her with it. It was almost like she was deemed to be a lost cause. I think one of the few examples of her trying to do things for women that was progressive was setting up a birth control clinic, which she tried to do first at Dartington, and everyone was too alarmed to come, and so she moved it to a kind of less intimidating place in Totnes, and that was obviously an important initiative, but very kind of sotto voce. It wasn't something that she was sort of proud of and had any manifesto about. And Dartington certainly did attract some artists who were also involved in feminism, but there wasn't really a strong intersection between Dartington and feminism, I don't think. But it's also interesting thinking about my work about utopias of this period more generally, that it's very, very difficult to find any feminist-led utopian communities. And I think maybe it was partly to do with what you're talking about, which is women who were interested in suffrage, interested in feminism, tended to be involved in the political movements in trying to gain a foothold in society as it was. And in a way, when you look at utopianism, it's about people stepping away from society as it was and yielding their foothold in society and trying something totally different. And so it was a bit counterintuitive maybe for women to necessarily go in that direction. But I think it's a sort of it's an unfortunate sadness about Dartington, which I don't think should obscure the fact that Dartington has been important in sexual politics, for instance, and there were lots of gay people who were sort of like in the purview of Dartington from the 1920s onwards, and it was a kind of place of tacit acceptance of otherness, but it just wasn't kind of leading the march in that direction. Dorothy and Leonard came from very elite echelons of society and continued to live in an extremely patrician way the whole time that they were at Dartington, until Dorothy died and Leonard moved away in the last years of his life. They lived in a great house. They had, as we were talking about earlier, a butler, a huge household retinue. Dorothy had 3 children by her first marriage, 2 children with Leonard, and those were raised in a nursery by a nanny. Despite their Dorothy and Leonard's kind of strong views about progressive education, those children had a very conventional and perhaps not entirely loving upbringing. Dorothy was a collector of art, astonishingly lovely modernist art, but a lot of that remained hanging in the great house and was not really part of the estate in her lifetime, which is kind of very surprising given her views about universal access to the arts. And while all this was going on, Dorothy and Leonard continued a rhetoric that Dartington was democratic and that it was run by the people for the people. Yet they could never really let go of the leadership, and they never really devolved leadership from themselves. They had this sort of view, let's educate the people and then they can be in charge, but they never really trusted the people to be in charge. So it was sort of very problematic tension, which I think probably was rolled out across most utopian communities of the era, because usually it was elite people who had the money to set these places up and sort of were vaguely left-leaning but unconfident.
If we're tracing influences and people who've taken up some of the ideas and then spread them or set up their own institutions, Michael Young springs to mind as being one person who was greatly influenced. He was somebody who went to school here, and he became a member of the trust, which was then set up to administer the whole thing, the charitable trust, which of course we still have today. He went on to live a very interesting and productive life. Perhaps talk about Michael Young, the influences he brought to the world generally that perhaps might have come from Dartington.
Yeah, I think Michael Young was basically a one-man missionary centre for Dartington ideas. We could talk about the things that he did in his lifetime kind of fairly endlessly. I think that would be an entire another conversation. But the main things I think he learnt at Dartington, or perhaps the main two things, were the wonder of combining ideals with practical activism and the importance of localised democracy. And he really espoused those things, and the Elmhurst really supported him in doing that. And I think forever afterwards, basically a huge number of his ideas were Dartington writ large. So he sent up the Institute for Community Studies in East London with Peter Wilmot, which was very much about getting people involved in their own communities, trying to create more balanced lives for people, trying to involve science with kind of more holistic, not quite spiritual form of contentment. All the things which Dorothy and Leonard were aiming for at Dartington, Michael Young kind of spread around the world.
And then, of course, he didn't he write a lot of some of the Labour policies after World War II, when it was the new Labour government. It was the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, let us face the future.
Yeah,
was the manifesto.
So, and some of those ideas have lived on, others haven't. But anyway, he was a very key person. Now, moving on to something a bit different, people talk of a sense of magic at Dartington. They talk about ley lines intersecting here and so on, and people swear they can wander around the old churchyard here, which of course have been here since medieval times, and see ghosts and so on. Now, this doesn't really feature, I don't think, in your book, but have you, not necessarily you've come across these sort of strange experiences, have you come across any, as a historian, you want really documented sources here, have you ever come across anyone who can really claim to have seen ghosts or spiritual apparitions?
I would struggle to come up with documented examples of those things, but one thing I would like to say is that Dartington from the beginning was envisaged as an important spiritual centre, and I think because that's a thing which is very hard to document and it doesn't really have, much of a tangible outcome, you can't measure productivity in that area, it's kind of been forgotten. But both the Elmhursts were brought up as Christians. Both of them lost their Christianity. Both of them thought that humankind needed a new kind of socio-spiritual centre or format, and they struggled to find that, and they didn't really. But Dorothy became great friends with this Anglo-Irish gay spiritual guru called Gerald Hurd, who used to come down to Dartington, and he set up a thing called the Generating Cell, which was, in the wake of the First World War, a vision of reconnecting all of humankind through these small localized generating cells which people would belong to, and their minds would be fused together with a superconsciousness. I mean, it sounds completely mad, but actually he was very influential at the time in sort of literary sets, intellectual sets, and his first practical experiment in having a generating cell was at Dartington. So Dorothy Elmhurst, Gerald Hurd, and various other of not Leonard, who thought this was complete nonsense, but a large number of sort of interesting people at Dartington would gather together, and they might read various religious tomes, they might listen to jazz music, they might look at art, they might study psychology, and they would try to use all of these different things to kind of draw their minds closer together. And in the Dartington archives, there are these wonderful, to me, quite nutty letters between the various members of this group about their experiences and about their kind of practical efforts to live out this fusing together of the superconsciousness. And this went on until just the beginning, the run-up to the Second World War, and Gerald Hurd and a lot of the other people who sort of visited Dartington, who were part of the cell, felt like this was one of the great inventions of the 20th century, like, the steam engine had been of the 19th century or whatever. It was like a very big thing for them. I think that's kind of underplayed because it seems kind of often silly now. And obviously that's not quite the same as psychic phenomenon. But the notion that Dartington, this very beautiful place where people are opting out of the material life and deciding to live in a different way, being a kind of melting pot for these new spiritual ideas, is very important. Then there was also Tagore and his Eastern influence, and then Mark Toby, who was an American painter, and Bernard Leach, who was a British potter, and various other people at Dartington, also including Dorothy became interested in Baha'ism, and so Dartington had a sort of Baha'i circle around the same time, and it had all of these different sort of spiritual things which were going on, which I think have rather fallen by the wayside as a central part of Dartington now. But maybe you could sort of feed into the notion that people's minds are open to the alternative here. Michael Chekhov came along, the nephew of Anton Chekhov, who is a choreographer and dancer, and had a very intensive regime for his students. He set up at Dartington, had a very intensive regime for his students, which involved sort of 6 hours a day of being in the studio in quite peculiar clothes, sort of a long robe and slippers. And Dorothy became one of his students and sort of an acolyte. And she really, I don't think it was, I don't think she had an affair as far as I know, but I think he became the all-important figure for her. And she was always seeking new ways of being for herself, better ways of being for the world. And that was really the thing that she believed in most, sort of beyond personal relationship, with Leonard, I think, in a sense. And so Michael Chekhov fled to America when he felt like Hitler was going to invade Britain, and Dorothy went with him. And that was a sort of very shaky moment, I think, for Dartington, because she represented money, and she and Leonard sort of represented Dartington for people. And it was a very, personally run utopia. And she did come back in the end, after not very long. But she, even when she was there, she wrote to Leonard about the kind of the joy of being part of a monastic regime and all of that kind of thing. So she was a lifelong experimenter, and I suppose Leonard was maybe in a sense a little more steady and normal in his functioning. And I suppose that did pose problems for them. Yeah, I think there are many new interesting initiatives going on around Dartington at the moment. I think that we're in a period of history, like in the wake of the First World War, where people are desperate for guidance, new guidance about how to live.